This is another edition of No Labels Talks. I'm here with brain trust of the center, middle, common sense majority, Ryan Clancy.
Thank you, Holly. How you doing?
I'm well. So we've got a couple of storms brewing. One's political and one's literal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is I was listening to the mayor of Tampa, who in just increasingly vivid terms is just telling people. I mean, I think the last thing I heard her say was, if you stay in your house, that's your coffin.
Wow, that's
So yeah,
terrible.
It's scary.
I've spent a lot of time at the lovely little town of Sarasota, Florida, and Longboat Key, and it's just once you know a place, it brings it to a whole different level. So I'm just obviously praying for all those folks there and hoping that something survives it.
Yeah, I mean, look, hopefully, this is one of those circumstances where they think it's going to be horrific, and then it takes a turn somewhere and it's not quite as bad. That's all we can hope for at this point.
Which will probably be the opposite of the other storm that's brewing, which is the presidential election.
Yes.
We hope it'll be good, but it probably will turn out to be kind of a disaster.
Yeah. Well, even more so, North Carolina, which of course is still recovering from Hurricane Helene. Now we're having issues with the early voting. There was a report that only like 1,000 mail ballots have been returned, even though 40,000 went out. So I don't know, we're already off to a difficult start just with the counting of the votes. It's not.
You can see how that will come back to haunt all of us, whoever wins. The side that loses, pointing to that whole catastrophe as a major factor. But the other thing that I'm paying attention to, because Ryan, I have 2 adult sons. I know it's hard to believe because I look so young, but and so I like to stay, there's this whole culture and conversation with young men going on in this country right now. So I like to check in every once in a while. So I do occasionally listen to Joe Rogan, and obviously the most listened to podcast in the whole country. And I have a prediction, actually, as the 2016 presidential campaign really played out over Twitter, going back to 1960, television. I think podcasts are going to be the platform that has a major impact on this campaign. And I say that because I believe that there's a whole conversation going on that is below the radar of those of us who follow politics like we do, and the traditional media. It's fascinating, but it's robust.
Well, the thing about podcasts, which, and this is not a totally original insight, but it does just lend itself to conversations you can't have on other formats. I mean, Joe Rogan shows 2-3 hours long sometimes.
Exactly.
So you can have these extended conversations where you actually get to places where people say real things and they have real discussions in a way that like a 3, 4, 5 minute media interview, or some interview, even the 60 Minutes interview, that was like really heavily edited. These podcasts, a lot of them are unfiltered. And
definitely, I agree. It turns out, it's a great format for us because our conversations do require a more thoughtful back and forth usually than what would fit into a soundbite. But it's not only Joe Rogan. There's a whole kind of universe of related podcasts that are all interwoven to what he's doing there. And I would say the common theme that I pick up, it's very, very anti-California.
Really?
They've got a real problem with California. Joe Rogan famously moved out of California and set up camp in Austin. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel. It's kind of a anti-California cabal. So we'll see what happens. But that is my prediction, that will come to be understood as having a major impact in the election.
I think you're right. I think one thing that won't have a major impact in the election is the subject of our discussion today, which was the national debt and the fiscal train wreck that we are barreling towards in this country. Not because it shouldn't be a subject of the election, it should be, but it's not. I mean, that was one of the things we we talked about on the podcast today, which is how this issue can be so serious and get almost no discussion whatsoever.
Totally agree. It also gives me a new appreciation for the service Ross Perot did provide for this country and connecting that enormous, complicated issue to Americans, enough so that it was a major factor in the 1992 campaign. And as a result of more Americans engaging in it, Bill Clinton was basically forced to work with Newt Gingrich and balance the budget. And we actually had a surplus, which is so hard to imagine in these days. And I just want to say, shout out to our guest, Maya MacGuineas. I actually worked for her on the Fix the Debt campaign. She is a remarkable person, a great combination of incredible intelligence and insight and commitment to our country. And she's really funny.
She's great.
Yeah.
And we had some wild card questions from the audience at the end, which she handled very capably and with good humor. So yeah, Maya MacGuineas, her organization is called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And in fact, they just released a new report on the fiscal impact of the Harris and Trump campaign plans. Spoiler warning, they both blow up the deficit, one worse than the other, but I'll leave it to Maya to talk more about that. So everybody enjoyed this week's conversation with Maya MacGuineas talking about debt deficits and why this is the dog that isn't barking.
And also, after you listen to this, make sure that you are all set up to come join us in Washington, D.C. on December 12th for a show of strength of the power of the middle.
Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with another edition of No Labels Talks. And with us today, we have Maya MacGuineas, who is the president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be with you guys.
So a bit about Maya before we get started. She's been testified up on the Hill so many times. She's always published and Post, the Journal, elsewhere, was previously at Brookings and worked in finance. For the last several years, she has been engaged in the very lonely struggle to exert some fiscal sanity on our government. And I want to start here, Maya, because you released a report this week that was not rosy in its implications. You took a look at the proposals from the Trump and Harris campaigns and concluded that both of them would significantly grow our budget deficit over time. In Harris's case, you said it'd be $3.5 trillion above our current baseline through 2035. Trump was about twice that. Could you talk a bit about what assumptions went into that analysis that you did?
Yeah, so first off, this was our excellent policy team that has been putting together spreadsheets that would blow your mind for a number of months, in fact, following basically every promise that's been made on the campaign. And there's obviously a huge amount of guesswork and guesstimates that is involved in this, which is why there's such a large range of what we assume for both candidates, with Vice President Harris's range going from not adding to the debt at all, or basically zero, to our middle estimate of $3.5 trillion, like you said, and this is all over 10 years, to a high end of about $8 trillion over 10 years added to the debt above, like you said, what's already being added. And for former President Trump, we found $1.5 trillion at the low end, the middle range, $7.5 trillion, all the way up to $15 trillion. And the reason that there's such huge variation is that the candidates aren't entirely clear about what their plans are. First, we will have to take things that are on their websites, on their platforms, but also things they say in speeches, though we have found that sometimes they'll float an idea in a speech and then back off, not repeat it again. Probably the most important thing we did is we talked extensively to the campaigns and ran our numbers by them and said, here's what we're looking at. What do you think? Obviously, we got pushback saying it's not nearly as bad as you think it is often. Yeah. But we would try to get as much detail on the policies as possible. And then when there wasn't detail provided to us, we would look at previous policies that match that or align what they're talking about. So in the case of Vice President Harris, sometimes we would take policies from President Biden's budget. There are large ranges of these because sometimes we would assume the economic growth or negative growth that would happen from the policies, and other times we would take more static scores. Almost always we relied on the Congressional Budget Office whenever possible for scoring so that we didn't have to make our own assumptions. And I'll also just answer one question I got from a lot of folks in the media, but people said, well, you're not saying like what would actually happen. And of course not. We're not, because we don't know what is going to be the outcome of this election. It's going to make a very big difference whether it's divided government or not.
Right.
But what we want to do, the objective is, let's put the importance of fiscal policy on the agenda, and let's show people what the overall promises coming out of the two campaigns look like in terms of their effects and priorities of deficit reduction.
So one weedy but important question, and you mentioned this a bit earlier, is when budget experts take a look at the future fiscal impact of policies, there is this debate between what's called static scoring and dynamic scoring. And the easy way to think about it is dynamic scoring just creates space for the possibility that some policies might have positive or negative effects on the economy over time that would grow or decrease revenues. Did you use dynamic scoring in the case of each of these plans?
Yeah, great question. So first off, I should say I like dynamic scoring in principle, because I think it's not the only factor that matters, but when you're looking at different policy options, knowing what would grow the economy, everything else equal, more pro-growth is always good. Sometimes you're going to endorse policies, prefer policies that aren't about growth, but it's a great thing to know. Unfortunately, we, meaning the collective country, we are not very good at scoring dynamic yet. We are working on it. You see numerous models popping up. There's three kinds of scoring. There's static, which means you don't look at any changes. We almost never use static. And we sometimes use conventional scoring, which looks at how something would change the behavior. If you put a tax on, if you put a tariff on, you're going to get less of those things. If you make an investment in certain things, you're going to create new behaviors, and that's going to have effects on your economy. We generally use that. And only in some estimates were we able to use all-out dynamic scoring, which not only looks at the behavioral changes, it looks at the changes to the underlying GDP. We did that when it was available, and the Congressional Budget Office does it, for instance, with immigration. But to do true dynamic scoring, you have to look at the entire plan comprehensively with its effect on GDP. And you can't really do that because we don't have dynamic scores for everything. But so, for instance, for taxes and revenues, when they're available, we did. The other thing I would point out, when you have large levels of debt, that actually is negative growth. And all of these plans add trillions to the debt. So if we were to look at the overall effects on GDP, it would bring it down in terms of the debt finance portion.
Maya, one of the things you put out on your social channels recently is that neither Trump or Harris, forget about the plans themselves, even rhetorically, getting our debt in order is really not a significant part of their campaign messaging, nor was it a part of either party's platform. In fact, the phrases debt and deficits did not even appear in the Republican Party platform, which—
So you did that too? You did the Control F on the platform?
Yeah, of course, yes,
that's
the easy trick. So it doesn't even, and you know, Democrats were no better. 30 years ago in '92, we had a campaign in which this was a central issue. Ross Perot's whole campaign was built about this. Clinton and Bush were out competing one another to prove that they were fiscally responsible. The reason that mattered is because that did set up an expectation for voters that this was going to happen. And of course, later in that administration, we had the last time the government ran a surplus for 4 years. So what we talk about in campaigns, we know matters. Why is it that even though the fiscal situation is so much worse today than it was then, debt as a share of our economy is now bigger than any time since World War II? Why, even though the problem is so much worse, is it so far down on the agenda?
That is really an excellent question. I ran into somebody last evening who was there in the Clinton era when they balanced the budget and had surpluses. And we were talking about the good old Ross Perot days. At one point, I actually flew down to Ross Perot and said, we're going to need you to come back and push these guys to be good again. because it was interesting. People weren't actually talking about the issue that much. And then Ross Perot's presence forced them to. And one of the reasons it was effective was not that he was ever going to win as president, but that once you talk about the issue, most people know you can't borrow trillions of dollars indefinitely and have your debt growing faster than your economy and stay a strong economy. Everybody sort of somewhere in their gut, even if they love those tax cuts and spending increases, knows that's not sustainable. So having somebody push it on the agenda was effective. What I think has happened since then, and it's very discouraging, is that not only is the fiscal situation worse, and now the problems are a lot harder than if we had addressed them before. And it's almost so big, it's daunting. We've really made a switch. Pre-COVID, we talked about billions. Post-COVID, we talk about trillions. Now it's hard to even like personalize what billions means, but trillions is a lot harder. But the bottom, the root of it, and this is what you guys, the important work that you all know labels focus on so much, but the deep levels of polarization are breaking our ability to govern ourselves in a responsible way. And what is happening, and what's unfortunate, is that bad fiscal policy often makes good politics. Meaning, if you go out and you promise, I'm going to give you huge tax cuts, I promise not to raise taxes on anybody or anybody making less than 400,000, which is most everybody. I promise not to fix Social Security, even though the program is going insolvent. And if we don't do anything, there will be across the board benefit cuts. It's a terrible policy that we're doing, not fixing it. But those promises work.
Right.
Right now, we are in a game of one-upmanship of fiscal pandering, where one candidate says, I'm going to do this tax cut, and the other candidate says, me too, me too. And I'm to take this off the table, me too, me too. And the problem is our deep levels of polarization are making everybody think that each election is like, existential threat. We hear that all the time. True or not, the debt is an underlying threat to every one of these existential policy threats we face. But I think the political advisors, probably rightly so, say this isn't going to win you anything. I will just say, at least if they could talk about the importance of it and educate the country on why this is an economic risk and a national security risk and a risk to future generations, at least they could create like a mini mandate to have that conversation once they were in office. But right now they're creating a mandate of not doing anything to fix it. And that's incredibly dangerous.
Well, here's one of the other problems is, up until recently, the media did not really hold either candidates to the feet to the fire in terms of making them say, hey, your numbers need to sort of add up here. That has started to change a little bit recently. So, at the VP debate, there was Nora O'Donnell asked some version of a how you all going to pay for this question. Bill Whitaker, the 60 Minutes interview, asked Vice President Harris a version of that question a couple times. The problem is the answers we've basically gotten is as follows. Both Harris and Trump try to avoid it. And then when cornered, Harris will say, well, we need to make the rich pay their fair share, or some version of that. And then Trump will say, well, I'm going to do all these tariffs, and then that's going to pay for everything. One of the things that becomes clear when you look at your analysis is either of those things will not remotely touch the problem. And so maybe you could talk in a little more detail about what is it that is really driving our structural deficit year after year. And just so we're clear on terms, the deficit is just difference between money in, money out in a given year. The debt is the cumulative addition of all that. The government just came out and said this year alone, the deficit is approaching $2 trillion. Why is this happening?
Thank you for your excellent questions. These are really good questions. And just to your first point about the media, not only have they not been covering it, it's been great. There's been a little coverage recently. Often they write about it almost in a backwards way, where the deficit and debt are the result of us not dealing with trade-offs. There are many things to do in government. There are many things both candidates want to do. Many of them are excellent. We're all going to disagree about which ones we like. And that's one of the great things about differences in politics. But what doesn't happen, and it's partially because we just don't pass budgets, which is remarkable, is the trade-offs are never made clear. And so if you want to do pre-K, if you want to do a tax cut, that's great. Those are admirable things to want to do. How are you going to offset the cost so you don't pay for them with borrowing? Often the media covers it in the reverse way. So if somebody talks about taxes or reforming Social Security, raising the retirement age for younger people or something, all of which are options we should be discussing. They almost play gotcha in their coverage, acting like this is a bad thing for the American people because they don't internalize those trade-offs as well. That's a problem. I think the good media coverage we've seen recently is encouraging. To your important point, the things that are driving our budget deficits right now are, one, we have huge automatic growth in some of our largest programs, Social Security, Medicare, other healthcare programs. They are growing both because the cost of those programs go faster than the economy and because of demographics, the aging of society. More people are moving into those programs. We didn't fix them over the past 20 years, despite warnings from the trustees every single year that you need to fix them. And they are now growing faster than the economy, squeezing things out. Number two, when interest rates stayed low over the past years, and many of us who were worried about this issue said, we've got to stop borrowing, you had other voices selling kind of the fun stuff, which is, no, we should borrow. Interest rates are so low, it's almost free. That's not true. What happens is we now have trillions more in debt. And when we had inflation, partially driven by excessive borrowing, that led to higher interest rates. That led to higher interest payments, which is the biggest squeeze in the budget right now. And you just referenced a CBO report that was out there yesterday about the big deficits of almost $2 trillion. Single fastest growing part of those budgets were interest payments. And that's where we are right now. Fastest growing part of the budget. You can get yourself in a dangerous debt spiral. We are now vulnerable to that. And then the third reason this is happening is because no one pays for anything anymore. There are times we should absolutely borrow. COVID, thank goodness we borrowed. The Great Recession, of course we were supposed to borrow. We had to. That's what kept things from being worse. But when the economy is strong, as it was under President Trump before COVID, and as it was under President Biden after we got out of COVID, they were borrowing those times too. Not just them, they and Congress were all borrowing, adding trillions to the debt repeatedly when what we should have been doing was bringing those annual deficits down. So we are now past the cycle of you borrow for emergencies and you run healthy fiscal situations when your economy is strong. They just borrow all the time because it's politically expedient and people are scared to tell voters, like, you can't have everything. It's not free. And they make up untruths, which is you could just pay for this from the top 2% of people. No, you can't. That's not enough money to do the things they're talking about. And while we're at it, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And while we're at it, you can't not touch Social Security and Medicare. You actually have to do things to fix them. So it's kind of the fiscal fantasies that they sell out there because, again, they think they're politically smart, but they're really doing quite significant damage to the fiscal foundation of our country.
Yeah, I mean, we wrote in one of our previous policy guides that if you ever see a politician answer the what are you going to do about the debt question, they say, well, I'm going to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. That's your surefire signal that they have no plan at all. Because yes, we all want to get rid of those things, but they're just a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. But here's the challenge. I want to read you some polling. You talked about Social Security and Medicare as really significant drivers over time. And as you noted, that's just as more and more people retire and live longer, which is great. But medical care continues to progress and get more expensive. That's just going to grow. But here's what the public thinks when you ask them. So Gallup asked, they asked voters to rank issues on the things that are among the most important or the single most important thing to you. 63% of people put Medicare and Social Security in that category. And then separately, other polling looks at, well, what should we do about it? A Pew poll found 79% say they oppose reducing the size of Social Security benefits at all for anybody. And 67% are against raising monthly premiums for Medicare. So given that, you are saying 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 voters are saying, I will not countenance benefit cuts to these programs I really like. What do you do? What is the way through this?
So there's a number of options. One, let's say that that's cemented and that's the way it is, and people want Social Security and Medicare, bigger benefits, growing every year, going to people, whether they're wealthy or not. Okay, then we've got to raise a lot of taxes to pay for that, a lot, or we've got to cut a lot of spending. And one of the things about our group, Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Total Budget, we're neutral on these policies. There's no right or wrong. If we want Social Security and Medicare, if we want them bigger than they are, we can have that, but we have to pay for it. The point is, I can't say to my kids and your kids, you guys pay for it. We're just going to borrow to get there, and we're going to lock you into a dangerous situation in the future. But the other thing that we found over the years is, yes, a lot of people say that these are incredibly popular programs. Programs where you send people checks or give them direct benefits are very popular programs, but they also tend to squeeze out things which are more public goods, public investment in human capital, basic R&D, infrastructure, these kinds of public investments. You're not getting a check, you're not getting direct medical care, so they're not as immediately popular, but once you talk about them, they are quite popular with the public. What we've seen over time is that the more you explain these issues to people, the more they might start to change their minds on what the trade-offs are. So if you want to pay for Social Security and Medicare, we're going to raise so much in taxes, but that's probably going to put us at the limit of what people are willing to pay. Frankly, it's probably going to put us above the limit of what people are willing to pay, but there won't be anything left for more investment in education or insurances when we start having disruptions from automation that's going to happen with technology, or new cybersecurity, which we're going to need higher levels of. Like, there are a lot of competing demands. So we have found, and we have a number of interactive tools on our websites, and there are different things out there that spend more time with people talking through the issues. As they become more educated, then they think through the trade-offs at a slightly more complicated level. One of the things we've seen is that the more people learn about Social Security, often people will switch and say, I do not want to see benefits changed for, the lowest 50% or 40% of people who depend on benefits. But for higher earners who don't need them, okay, we could lower those benefits. We could means test them or change them. So what's sad is that this moment of campaigning is not an opportunity. It is an opportunity. It's not being used as an opportunity to educate the public about what the real choices are. If you promise us everything, we're going to say, yeah, we want tax cuts and spending increases. But if someone talked to voters as though they're adults and went through the various trade-offs, you find that the preferences become a little bit more nuanced in what they want and where they see those choices are.
Before we get to questions, and people can just press the raised hand button, and be happy to call on you after. I want to just get to what would it look like, not to solve it, but to start to solve this. The last time that Washington seriously tackled this was over a decade ago. There was a big commission at the time. You, of course, know well, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, named after the two former senators who chaired it. This was a situation where Congress basically realized, look, we can't, through the regular process, litigate all these trade-offs ourselves. We're going to deputize this commission of experts and, blue ribbon commission to come up with a grand proposal. And when Simpson-Bowles Commission released its findings, all the opinion pages said, this is really smart and sensible, and we're going to do a little trim here on the benefits programs and these slight tax increases there. And then it was totally dead on arrival. The politicians could not get away from this fast enough, and it went nowhere. And that was the end of that. So my question is, what is an approach in terms of a leadership approach, a procedural approach that could at least start to begin this conversation and put us on the path to solving it?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And I wish the answer were, listen, we know the policies that are needed to fix this. We are just going to put them in place. But clearly our politics is not able to do that right now. If one person comes out with a responsible plan, they are immediately targeted, ads run against them, the ARP phone banking against them. Like, it's brutal to come out there and be specific. So I think there is a combination of process and a commission that's probably helpful to give us a real shot at this happening. Let's look back at why Simpson-Bowles didn't end up working. After that commission came out with what I thought were excellent recommendations, I was ready to say, same old waste, fraud, and abuse. No, it was serious and balanced and actually widely supported. There were 80 senators who agreed that they were going to vote for that blueprint, as there was also a supermajority in the House. What happened was actually leadership. Really, some leaders were very helpful. There were some leaders who stood in the way, didn't want to solve the problem. And we've seen something, which is the political leaders of parties often like to keep the issues alive so they can run against them. They don't want to solve the problems. You all know this. You all have been instrumental in trying to create ways that improve this. They want to keep those issues alive. We have to avoid that. So we have to have some processes and I think another commission with lessons learned. First, we have to pass a budget. I think you guys basically invented no budget, no pay. Such a great idea. Like, if you're not going to budget, I worry about no budget, no pay because there's so many people who don't need their paychecks in Congress. It's unfair. But like, there's a bunch of ideas. Like, what about no budget, no passing other legislation that costs something until you have a budget in place? I can't do it at my nonprofit. Most of you can't do it at your businesses if you don't have a budget there. So back to your original idea of no budget, stop doing everything else. Really important. Pay-go, pay as you go exists, and then Congress circumvents it. In January, there will be a pay-go scorecard that they will vote to ignore. Let's not have them do that. Let's say, actually, we need to pay attention to this pay-go scorecard. And if you can't meet the amount you have to save this time, which is going to be very high, about $1.6 trillion, let's find some other savings you'll put in place instead. So there are a bunch of process reforms like that I think we need to discuss. Pay-go, spending caps. But we still need that. Those will help it not be worse. We still need a debt deal. And so once again, I think we need to look back. There is bipartisan, bicameral support right now for a fiscal commission. This time, it has to be statutory. It cannot be a presidential commission, which was ultimately ignored. If they come to an agreement, and that's a big if, it's going to be hard. But if they do, it has to come to a vote, right? So we have to create defaults where if they're willing to do this work and lend the political cover, and we can work at the same time they're doing that for a public education effort on why this matters, it has to go up for a vote. But I think the fiscal commission will be very helpful because honestly, a lot of members haven't had time to really study this issue. They believe their own talking points, but once you dig deep into it, and I encourage anybody out there, you could go to our website. You could also go to the Congressional Budget Office. I read one of those reports in my 20s and it literally changed my life. I changed my entire career because I thought it was so interesting and important. Really good stuff you can learn out there. We need our members of Congress to be that educated. This is complicated. Spend a year working on solutions. And again, no guarantees. I'm not going to wood, but I think that could be a very strong approach to get us back on track.
Yeah. One of the approaches I know you've heard of before, which is interesting, is at the end of the Cold War, when the US had to close down a bunch of military bases, it dawned on the members that, hey, no member of Congress is ever going to vote to close down the base in their own district. So they had what was called this Base Realignment Commission. And just as you're proposing, it was a group of experts took a look at it. They said, all right, look, this is the proposal, and you can only do an up or down vote on it. No changing it with amendments or anything else. Some people thought that might be the approach we have to take with the fiscal issue. But
I think absolutely that makes sense. I mean, in the end, Congress gets to decide whether they're adopting anything or not. But instead of each person saying they need their little tweak and they need their little gift in their district, which we know could blow it up, it could have so many poison pills inserted. I think we get a big, diverse group of members of Congress to work through these issues. And if they can come to an agreement, you bracket, which is what that was. We have an up or down vote. And I think that, again, will then cover, because then you can see any politician saying, well, obviously we need to do something. Would I have done this? No, I would have done much, much better. But we needed to get this done. And so that helps them. And honestly, a lot of members of Congress who know how important this is would like to have that kind of political cover. So I think you'd see some real support for that same style of commission.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, let's get to some questions. We got plenty of people in the queue here. If you could keep your question to just under 30 seconds so we can get several questions my way, that would be much appreciated. Let's start with Richard. And if you can also say where you're calling in from. Richard. I think we lost Richard. Art. Can you hear us, Art?
You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I won't preface this. It touches on some of the things you said. As a tactical and a political matter, why can't we get a group of fiscally responsible members of Congress to say that they are not going to deal with the Trump tax cut extensions until there's a focus on some of the campaign promises, and specifically There's been a lot of talk about reforming the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit on both sides in terms of things like work incentives, maybe combining the two. To me, that seems like a prime example of something where if you hold off on deciding what to do with the Trump tax cuts, you can come up with new bipartisan solutions on that and then see how that affects what the distributional effects of extending any of the old tax cuts are. So it's a stop everything until we deal with some of these major proposals. Is that stupid to assume that that's a possible course of action?
What do you think?
No, it's not stupid at all. It's gonna the opportunity. So 2025, huge fiscal year. We have the debt ceiling hitting in January, which then will be pushed out because of extraordinary measures, but sometime in the summer or early fall, we'll be dealing with that. The expiration of these tax cuts, which both parties have said they want to extend in some amount, those are action forcing moments. And action forcing moments are unfortunately the only time Congress does anything. So yes, we need to think about how to take advantage of those moments. I like your approach. I'm going to make one caveat from my perspective, which is what I could see happening is, okay, good. Then we'll extend the Trump tax cuts in return for keeping the expanded EITC. And that's what we often do, doubling down on unpaid for policies. So I'm going to push us to go in the other direction, which is you cannot extend any part of the Trump tax cuts that isn't offset. And you cannot extend the EITC, expand it, an expanded version of it, without offsetting it. That's sort of the pay-go rule, which is, can we really strictly say, these are absolutely legitimate policies to pursue? I'm not going to say that one's better or the other, like everyone has different preferences. I love that diversity. I love that people like different policies, but can we agree that at a moment of record debt levels, we won't put a single policy in place that adds to the debt other than for a national emergency when we should borrow? And I'd like, I hate pledges, but that's the pledge I'd like the candidates to say, I won't borrow unless it's a national emergency.
Yeah.
But does that, so Art, I understand your point, but I'm just worried about the price tag of
No,
that.
I understand. As a corollary, one could also maybe get agreement to extend the Trump cuts untouched for a year, which might also allow not only issues to be addressed, but a fiscal commission to get in place.
Yeah, I do think that these are moments we should be asking for a fiscal commission at the end of this year, by the way. They're going to have to extend the CR, and they're probably going to try to put on a lot of things on that moving fiscal train that will add to the debt. I think members of Congress, and we should be asking our members of Congress, should insist, I'm not doing this deal without a fiscal commission or something else that would improve the process. These action forcing moments are ones that we have to think about strategically how to build on them.
Great point. Great point. Michael, you have a question. You're on mute, Michael.
Yeah, okay, that work?
Yep, gotcha.
Okay. Yeah, Mike in Evanston, Illinois. Thank you, Maya, for your hard work. It seems to me it's not complicated for people to understand that everyone is living longer and most people are working longer. What is the effect of raising the retirement eligibility age by 1 year? Is that a massive savings to the system or not? And why can't people get together on that? Because it's to me such a logical thing that everyone should understand, and it should be able to be explained.
Yeah. First, Michael, I am a Northwestern grad, and I have not been back to Evanston, and I love Evanston. So I'm bringing my kids to see where I went to college this summer. So love Evanston. And thank you for the question, because raising the retirement age, again, we're policy neutral in that we support whatever we could do to improve the fiscal situation. But in my mind, that is just one of the most eminently sensible policies out there. To your specific question, it doesn't raise that much money 1 year because you can't start right away. We can't raise the retirement age for somebody who's 66 and about to retire and then say, psych, you got another year to go. So you put it in for anybody under 50 or things like that. You pick an age. If it phases in that slowly, it doesn't actually start to generate savings over time. So until over time, it takes a long lag before you're getting savings. But the retirement age coupled with a couple other things, whether it's lifting the payroll tax cap somewhat, slowing the growth of benefits on the high end, changing how we calculate inflation, all of those things do a package. But the retirement age is going to be less than 25% of that contribution, probably less than 20%. But it is a really important piece because over time, it compounds and gives you more savings, particularly if not only do you raise it 1 year, but you index to life expectancy. Because guess what? With some of this tech and biotech things we're possibly moving into, people may be living really long very soon. I would recommend we make the program structurally balanced by saying retirement age reflects life expectancy, and that would help with that. And important caveat, that's easy to say if you run a nonprofit or you have a desk job. Obviously, there need to be very, very strong protections for people who are doing work where they can't be expected to work to 68, 69, whatever. So you want to have that strong disability component that goes along with it so people don't work past when they can.
An important point Maya made is one of the common denominators of all of these reforms is almost any one you do, if you phase it in over time and give yourself a long runway, it's an easier adjustment, and the longer you wait, the harder it gets. That's really a common thing with all of them. Alan has a question. Hey, Alan.
Hey, Alan.
You're still on mute, I think.
Is that good?
There we go.
All right. Maya, I hope you took a taxi in.
Alan, it's a good story, but
It's an inside story. So just a couple of quick things. Maya, you know, I love your work. I think the conversation we're having is not kind of comprehending the magnitude of the crisis. And because of everything you just said, you know, when we did the Greenspan Commission in '83, you made adjustments that are saving us a bunch of money now. But, you know, some of these adjustments, when you wait until we actually have this massive wave of retirement, for example, there's not a lot you can do. So my point about this is, look, we're not, and especially since we like tripled our debt while interest expense was flat as we paid off the other debt, which is all that people measure. So we're at a stage now, we're on a path pretty soon to have 75% of every single dollar the government spends to be entitlements and interest. And so that leaves 25% for everything else in the budget. And so we really have to think about, and not so much politically right this minute, but what we could be able to put on the table. And Maya, as you know, I think a VAT, we're the only OECD country that does not have a VAT. And if you really want to get seniors who are wealthy, tax their consumption, and then offset it with tax credits. I think, you know, I want to ask you, Maya, I think we have to think about out of the box, like carbon tax or carbon credits or things. We got to find a real new way to get revenue, because the path of spending, and then we have to make some adjustments, but the path of spending is already locked in. And so, you know, especially the interest on the debt, there's not a lot we could put in legislation to say, let's not pay our interest, which is now higher than defense spending, right? So I think we need to be saying we need to come up with some new ideas that are significant, because we've waited so long. And the only thing I want to say is Sam Nunn, who is a friend of mine with the Nunn-Lugar bill that did the base closing, Sam had suggested during the Simpson Bowls, one thing you could do is put together a commission and then have them come up with a plan, and then go back to both parties and said, okay, we will give you 6 months or 3 months or whatever to go in a room. And if you want to together negotiate something that you're both willing to support that you think is better than this, go ahead. But if you can't get it done in that period of time, then you have to vote ahead of time that this will go into effect. And that way you can get, you know, people to come in and come up with a plan that then people could tweak if they want. But you say, but the standard is this is going in unless you guys come up with something else that you'll vote for.
So Maya, what do you think of those two ideas in particular? The idea of structuring a commission with much stronger, you bet you have to do this mechanisms, number one. And then the other idea of just a new source of revenue, either a value-added tax, a carbon tax, to meet the growing gap. What do you think of both those?
Yeah, I support both those ideas, absolutely. So, Alan, thanks for your question. And Alan and I have many discussions about this, and he has this great historical context that he brings into all of these things and great work on demographics as well. But it's true that our spending is on a track where there's no political will to really bring it down below where it is. That's driven by demographics. We also have a national security situation that is worse than we thought a number of years ago. And while there's a lot of savings we can have in national defense, I think realistically, there's also probably going to be a lot of pressure on defense to go up. And again, like I had mentioned, I think there will be big dislocations and disruptions in the economy, and there'll have to be ways to adapt to that. So I am a big supporter of let's bring spending down and let's bring revenue up. But I've noticed that the parties are pulling back from the spending cut portion. Actually, really interesting in this report that we just did, we haven't published this part yet, but if you look at both the Harris and the Trump proposals, both of them have spending as a share of GDP higher than where we are today, higher than where we're projected to be over the next 10 years. So under Trump, the Republicans are not the party of small government or spending cuts anymore. So there seems to be a real pulling back from cutting spending as a big piece of this. I still support a lot of spending reductions, but bottom line, you're not getting this done without revenue. You're not getting this done without both of them. The problem is so large that just to keep the debt as a share of GDP where it is at about 100% of GDP over 10 years, you would need savings of $9 trillion. Like that blows our heads. We don't know what that means. But the Fiscal Responsibility Act they passed last year was about $1.5 trillion. Simpson-Bowles was $4 trillion. So $9 trillion is huge. We're not even talking about balancing the budget. That will be almost twice that much. Yeah. So yes, we're going to need more revenue. I do think a carbon tax is an excellent idea because it has multiple objectives that it would meet. Consumption tax makes tons of sense. One other area I'll put on the table, we lose upwards close to $2 trillion a year in lost revenue from tax expenditures, which are deductions, credits, exemptions, exclusions. There are a lot of ways that you could basically just limit all of those tax breaks and generate a huge amount of revenue Many of them are not good policy. They pay us to do what we would do anyhow. They are regressive. There's a lot of reforms that should come in the tax expenditure place. They're very popular. I did once write an op-ed saying we should get rid of the home mortgage interest deduction, and that was the first death threat I ever got. So that wasn't well received. But that's just another area that we should look at for where we could actually get some reforms and generate some revenue.
Interesting. Jay, question for you. Jay, you're on mute.
Okay. Maya, thanks for your information. Has your organization looked at some of the program growth, in particular Medicare and Social Security, that has been done, I believe, through regulatory guidance from these agencies and not statutory acts of Congress? You know, for one example, I'm in healthcare. They're contemplating adding abortion and contraception benefits to Medicare. Now, that might blow your mind, who over 65 needs it, but the reality is they are bringing on Social Security disability people. I think it's tens of millions, but it's been a few months since I read it. And therefore, they force them to go on Medicare a year after they're on disability. I see ads will help you qualify for Social Security disability. I think the state of Michigan or someone is paying attorneys fees to help people qualify. It's just, it's chaos, but it's the organizations within government that just want to grow their bureaucracy, and Congress is clueless.
That sounds like you actually are more of an expert on this specific one than I am, which is really interesting. But yes, we have had to start working in this area much more because the changes from the agencies and also executive actions out of the White House, which are growing. And we saw this with student debt, for instance, but we are now talking about huge price tags attached to things that do not go through Congress. So I just served on a commission that was about the power of the purse and trying to work with some reforms that would bring spending and taxes back to Congress where it's supposed to be in the Constitution, and think through those things. But you need a regulatory pay-go, a form of that too, because there are huge costs that are put without any constraints. And I think you identify a big problem. We are moving more into that area because it is being utilized more than it used to be.
Yeah. And the other thing is, when is the government employee is going to move to 401k like every other employer in the country? and get off pensions. Pay as you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kathleen, you have a question?
I really don't have a question. I just have multiple, probably radical ideas, but one is to form commissions for each agency, comprised of people in the agency, outside expertise, and to tell every agency, your budget is now zero. So now you need to tell us exactly what you're doing with your money. Every program, what you're spending on it, and all of that. And we're going to review it. Then you review it and you say, why are we studying the process of tea, for example? I don't know if they're still doing that, but why are you doing that? And then you eliminate what you think is ridiculous. You leave what you think is feasible, and you may add, since you have eliminated all these things. Nobody knows what anybody is doing in government and how much we're spending per agency. That's number one. As far as Social Security and Medicare, I fully think, I do not think of it as an entitlement. I think of it as me paying in, having taxes taken out when I was paid in, and then being taxed again when I received the benefits. So I think the thing that you have to do with Social Security is to look to the future. And like Sweden, a lot of their citizens, they have a retirement plan and they take a small portion of it, which is fixed, and the government can invest that for them. And they invest the rest. And they've actually had 10% returns as high as 10% by doing this, because they have a fixed, they have buy-in. And I really think that is how you're going to have to approach Social Security, because there's a lot of seniors on this call, including myself, and you have to realize how we view it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have to get buy-in for anything you want to do. And frankly, I really think the younger ones would be much better off having a large portion taken out and put in various buckets for them that they have chosen. And then a small portion, kind of a fixed portion, that if they blow it all on parties or whatever, at least they have something.
So Maya, Kathleen's on actually two ideas that have been proposed before. One of which is this concept of zero-based budgeting, which is to say, right now, every year, agencies just kind of build their budgets based on whatever they did the previous year. There's some who say every single year, an agency should start from zero and have to justify everything they're going to do from scratch. So that's one idea. The second idea is Social Security. Not everybody knows this, but when payroll taxes come in, those funds go into treasury bonds, which really don't pay that higher returns historically compared to the stock market. There are some reform proposals out there that say, why isn't some portion of that, either the government doing the investing or the individuals themselves, invested in the stock market, which tends to have much higher returns over time? What are your reactions to both those ideas?
Yeah, so on to your first one, Kathleen, these are great ideas. Very, very glad you threw those out. So on the first one, zero-based budgeting, or having to justify the programs, evaluate them. We do a ton of evaluating. It's then not worked into the budget process at all. It's as though people fill out tons of forms evaluating things, put it on the side, and go back and fund everything they were doing plus more. So once you have a program, it's really hard to get rid of it. And I completely agree. We need to build in a process where you reevaluate, you re-justify, and you determine whether it's still worth it. We have lots of things that were solving the problems of the past that no longer exist. But once you have a constituency of people benefiting, their voices tend to be much louder than the rest of us who are paying a small amount, all of us, for each of these programs, which adds up to a huge amount. So yes, we need, I don't know that you should do it every single year. That's probably a huge undertaking, but you could stagger it. And so absolutely, I think all these programs have to be put up for review and justified. You're not going to like my answer on Social Security, but here we go. First off, my dad disagrees with everything I say on Social Security, and he just says, Maya, keep your hands off my Social Security. I paid it. The truth is that when Social Security started, the retirement age was 65 and life expectancy was 62. And it was a program that was put in place so that it could provide an annuity, benefits for anybody for their entire life. But then as life expectancy grew and grew, we didn't alter either the payment, so we weren't putting in enough more to cover that, and we weren't changing the retirement age. And so now what we have is people who on average, I believe, are getting $600,000 at this point out of Social Security more than they paid in. My dad doesn't like it when I say that. I know you don't like it when I say it either. There's an idea for legislation. You're muted. I can't hear you, but I can guess what you're saying. You're still muted, Kathleen.
Maya, this idea is going over as well as your get rid of the mortgage interest deduction.
Yeah, exactly. I know. You know what? Being fiscally responsible, it does not make you the most popular person. It is 100% true. But so here's a piece of legislation somebody once suggested. I thought it was great. It's like, if you have now received everything out of Social Security you paid in, your check would change colors, just so people would know for education, because most people don't know that's the case. Anyhow, luckily,
In my case, I know I'm not getting $600,000 more. I
what
know
if
the
you-
numbers.
It's not now. It depends on how long you live. It's if you live for a long time.
Even if I live to 110, I would be getting.
So, but then when it becomes, and seniors do not need to worry. If there's one political promise that our politicians are going to commit to, they're not touching benefits for current retirees. They're just not. It's the most powerful voting group there is out there. So all of these are talking about in the future. But I think it does.
You have to worry about the young ones also.
What?
You have to worry about the young ones also.
Well, that's the thing. So every dollar that doesn't come from, baby boomers or people who moved into retirement who might not need it will come from younger people. And just the plea I will put out there is, let's look at the world right now. It's rough. There's climate, there's natural disasters, there are geopolitical risks, there are new forms of weapons that are kind of scary that are going on. Our kids and our grandkids do not have an easy road in front of them. And what I am worried about is saying, we are giving you a budget that has the biggest item in it, second biggest right now, interest payments. You have promised that you will, when I retire, you're going to support me, you're going to support anyone in retirement, and they are not going to have the freedom to build a budget that will meet the needs of their moment. That's what worries me. Finally, you just talked about investing. I did my master's thesis on how to change to a system that would invest. The problem is that made great sense. When I wrote this a while ago, we had big surpluses in Social Security. Now all the money that's going in taxes every year, plus some, is used to pay for current benefits. So if we took money out to invest, there'd be less money to pay for current retirees. We lost the moment. It was a great option about 2 decades ago when we had big surpluses in the program. We don't any longer, and it's one of the big costs of waiting that we lost that opportunity. Yeah. We could add on, we could put more money in and invest it, but there's not a surplus to invest right now because it's going directly to retirees.
Well,
yeah, Senator Katz,
excuse me, real quick, and then I'm going to be quiet. The reason I mentioned commissions was I think we have the fox guarding the hen house.
Mm-hmm.
And that nothing is going to change until that dynamic is changed.
That's a good point.
That's why I'm saying commissions need to be established for each agency with expertise that, can't be disputed in the area of that agency. And that's the only way I think this is going to be fixed. Congress is like a fox in the hen house. So I'm going to be quiet now.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. And we hope you're collecting Social Security benefits for a really long time.
Yes, we do.
Look, Maya, thank you so much for taking a couple of minutes with us today. You give us a lot to think about. I would encourage anybody, if you haven't, go to the committee. It's cfrb.org, correct?
CRFB.
Yep, CRFB.
Tough name, tough acronym. Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB.
Yep. To check out their analysis of the Harris-Trump plans. A lot of great work there. Maya, we hope to have you on again soon, maybe in the new year when we get some clarity as to What's actually
Yeah.
going to happen with these?
Before I jump off, I just want to say thanks to you guys. I want to say thanks to No Labels. I want to thank the people who are on the call. These are great questions. Everybody who's engaged in, like, this is something, I'm a political independent. This is so near and dear to my heart, but I think the work that this group is doing and all of you by being engaged like this is so important, and just want to throw that appreciation back to you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya, and likewise for all the great work you're doing. A final reminder for those of you on the call, and I think you've heard us mention this before, 1 month after the election, No Labels national meeting in DC on December 12th. If you are interested in coming, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to tell you how you could be with us for that really important meeting. In the meantime, look forward to seeing you all on future calls. We're going to be moving to several discussions on defense and foreign policy in subsequent calls over the next couple of weeks. So really hope you can join us. In the meantime, thank you all again for your great questions, and talk to you again soon.